The Atlas Six, Parissa. She could always tell where he was in the house. For one thing, there were huge amounts of magic around him. Knots of it, tangled, and they seemed to arise in bursts like flames. For another, his thoughts were less guarded when he was working, owing to the fact that he typically worked alone. He was very often alone, unless he was walking the grounds with Atlas or instructing the six of them in some way, or if he were working with society members who came in for special projects. At night, he slept very little. She could hear his thoughts buzzing, localizing around something. She couldn't identify from far away until she recognized the sound of something unmistakable. Parissa. Why sex? Because it was so easily emotionless, uncomplicated, primal, a straightforward return on baser urges. Because thoughts, however malformed or mishappen they might become in the heat of the act, could not be so readily protected during something so chemical, and they certainly did not disappear. Good sex was never mindless. It merely meant concentration was somewhere else, not gone. Parissa knew her craft well enough to know that, and thus she knew she'd succeeded the first time she kissed him, slipping something in the latch of his thoughts so she'd always be invited in. She'd kept a distance afterwards, but the summer had been long enough for him to wonder. He was thinking increasingly about her, and she'd already visualized him enough in private to know which places she wanted to touch first, where she planned to put her lips, her hands, her teeth. She had given him the thrill of her presence, leaning over when he gestured to something, filling his atmosphere with her perfume. He knew the contents of her file, just like he knew the others. He knew her skill set, her history, which meant that he knew the touch of her hand, brushing his when she passed him, on the stairs or in the hall, was only the surface of an unimaginable depth. Once she poured herself a glass and sat in his presence across the room unmoving, saying nothing, bringing some champagne to her lips, letting it settle across the bed of her tongue. She had felt the vibration of his thoughts, the tension between them, which kept him from concentration. He read the same sentence 18 times. Tonight he was alone in the reading room. To his credit, he didn't look very startled to see her, though he had the presence of mind not to reveal his relief. You shouldn't, he cautioned, leaning wearily back in his chair. He didn't specify whether he meant that she shouldn't be there or that she shouldn't come closer, but she was, so she did. He didn't argue, nor did he seem to give any indication he intended to. His mind was at present a sealed vault. In her experience, that was hardly something he could maintain for long. You seem tired, Parissa said. She wandered closer, running her fingers over the wood of the table. She brushed the corners of his foot, placing the tactility of her skin at the forefront of his mind. He closed his eyes when she slid her hand from his arm to his shoulder, letting it hover in place for a moment. They had touched countless times by then, innocently but often enough that memory would do half the work for her. Something wrong? You shouldn't be here. She could see the skin of his forearms pebbling at the brevity of their contact. Not everything was a matter of telepathy. I thought there wasn't rules. There weren't rules. I wouldn't call this a rule. It was unfortunate that restraint looked so good in him. He was tense in all the right places, poised for a fight. What would you call it? Inadvisable. His eyes were closed, so she slid the tip of her fingers to his neck, floating them over the hollow of his throat. Possibly wrong. Wrong. Her fingertips danced below his collar, tracing his clavicle. Don't tempt me. He caught her hand in a sudden motion, circling her wrist with his fingers. Are you being careful, Parissa? She had the sense he was talking about her there here and now. Should I be? She asked. You have enemies. You mustn't. Why not? I always have enemies. It's unavoidable. No, not here. Not. He broke off, finding someone somewhere. Parissa, don't waste your time on me. Find someone in your initiation class, someone reliable. That, or make yourself indispensable somehow. Why? She said with a laugh. Because you don't want me to leave? Because I don't want you to. He broke off, eyes snapping open. What do you want from me? He asked her quietly, and before she could open her mouth, he said, I'll give it to you if it means you'll work hard at playing this game. There it was again, the acrid sense of fear. Is it answers? He pressed her. Information, what is it? Why me? She slid out of his grip, stroking his hair from his temples. What makes you so sure I want something, Dalton? She had wanted to say his name, to test it out experimentally, so she did. She could see on his face how viscerally he suffered for it. You do, I know you do, he inhaled sharply. Tell me what it is. What if I tell you I don't know? She murmured, maneuvering from behind his chair to position herself against the table, leaning back on her palms. What happened? His hands seemed to levitate in a trance, moving of their own accord to find her hips. Maybe you intrigue me, maybe I like a puzzle. Play again with someone else, and then Nico, Callum. The mention of Callum's name gave her an involuntary bristle, and Dalton looked up, brows furrowed. What is it? Nothing. The room was lit from above, but down here there was only the single desk lamp to cast illumination over Dalton's features. I have no interest in Callum. Dalton's lips brushed a fabric of her dress, above her stern and below the hollow of her throat. His eyes closed, then opened. I saw what he did, I watched. Dalton gestured evasively around. There are surveillance enchantments, wars everywhere, and I was watching the two of you all at the time. I saw it. So you saw him kill her then? The reminder nearly gave Parissa a shiver, or would have if she were less responsible with her own control. No, Parissa. Dalton reached up, touching her cheek, a single brush of his thumb right over her bone. I saw her kill herself, he said softly, and though it was the worst time, surely the wrong one. Parissa instinctively pulled him closer. Impulsively, she wanted him in her grasp. She had nursed his affinity for her, making him crave her like an addict. One job, and he would go too far. He gave in easily, readily, perilously, like madness. His hands clutched her hips, and he set her roughly at the edge of the table, inciting a burst of heat. People can do unnatural things, dark things sometimes. He sounded hungry, ravenous, desperate. His lips brushed her neck, and she sighed. Something she'd done countless times before and would do countless times again. Still, it was different even when it was the same, and with him it was unprofessionally persuasive. This was the magic of sex, the animation, something coming alive inside her at his touch. Can't you strike a deal with the devil if it means getting what you want, he whispered. Her eyes fluttered sharp, and she thought of Callum. Aren't you tired? All this work, all this running, none of it you can ever escape? I can feel it in you, around you. You can feel nothing for anymore. Do you? Only erosion, fatigue, depletion, your exhaustion is all you are. Parissa shuddered and pulled Dalton closer so that his pulse aligned with hers. Both were arithmetic and unsteady. What are you fighting for? Do you even know anymore? You can't leave this behind you. They will chase you, hunt you, follow you to the ends of the earth. You already know this. You know everything. How they will kill you 1,000 different ways, bit by bit, piece by piece. How they will destroy you little by little by robbing your life from you. Her hands traveled up Dalton's spine, nails biting into the blades of his shoulders. Your death will have to be at their hands, on their terms, not yours. They will have to kill you to keep themselves alive. She felt him come closer to breaking, teetering on the edge. You have a choice, You have only one true choice in this life. Live or die. It is your decision. It is the only thing no one else can take from you. Dalton's lips, when they met hers, were spiced with something, brandy and abandon. She slid her fingers through his hair, reveling in his shiver, and tugged her closer. Like a reflex from a fall, she reached behind her, shoving the books aside. Dalton slid his hands under her dress, wrapping his hands around her thighs. The gun you're pointing at us. Do you even know who we are? Do you know why you're here? Promise me, Dalton said. Promise me you'll do something. Turn the gun around. Dalton, I pulled the trigger. Parissa gasped, blood and madness coursing through her, and when he shoved the dress up her legs, drawing her closer. In her mind, she watched the assassin's death again, over and over. Turned the gun around. Then the smell of fire. A woman's blood spraying at her feet. Pulled the trigger. Callum hadn't even lifted a finger. He'd barely drawn breath. Turned the gun around. He had looked the woman in the eye and convinced her to die. Pulled the trigger. Her death had cost him nothing, not even a second thought. Was the kind of devil Dalton meant? Was that the kind of devil Dalton meant? I am not good, Dalton told her, rasping into her mouth. No one here is good. Knowledge is carnage. You can't have it without sacrifice. She kissed him hard. He fumbled with her dress and dropped to his knees, tugging her hips towards him. She felt the hard edge of a book stabbing in the base of her spine. Then the inedible sweetness of Dalton's mouth, his kiss, his tongue, and his lips. Her back arched off the wood, accommodating her quiet sigh. Somewhere in Dalton's mind, things were coming loose. A door was opening. She slid inside and sealed it shut behind her, tugging the roots of his hair. What was in there? Nothing much. Even now, not even in his head, she was careful. She could only find fragments, remnants of things, fear still traces of guilt. He needed to come untied, come undone. She could pull at few strings and glimpse his insides, find the source of it. If she could set him in on a path bound for destruction, she tugged him to his feet, hastily flaying open the zipper of his trousers. There wasn't a man alive who couldn't sink into her with the blankness, the blindness of ecstasy. Satisfaction was obstructive that way. She yanked at his hips, clawed into his spine, bit into the muscle of his shoulder. If they were caught like this, so it be it. They'd be caught. He had imagined this before. She could watch the evidence of it like a flipbook in his mind. He had already had her 100 different times, 1,000 ways, and that she could see it now was promising. There was a weakness in his defense, and it was her. Poor thing, poor little academic trying to study his books and keep his distance, when really he was fucking her on her hands and knees in the abscesses of his tired mind. Even this, taking her here on the table covered with his notes. He had seen her before. Prophecy. It was like he had spirited this very vision to life. They both gasped. He wanted the two of them close. He should her securely, fastened in his arms, and so did she. From here she could taste the burning edges of his thoughts. He wasn't afraid of something. He was afraid of everything. He hated his house, the memories in it. The memories themselves were knives, glinting in the light. They pricked her fingers, warning her away. Turned the gun around, pulled the trigger. They were demons in her hair, devils. Can't you strike a deal with the devil if it means getting what you want? There was boyhood in her too, juvenile and furious and small. Once he had brought a dead sapling back to life, only to watch it wither away and die regardless. The taste of him on her tongue, real and imagined, was burnt sugar, wild adoration, tender rage. Poor thing, poor desperate thing, Clarissa recalled the thoughts of in Raina's head which the naturalist couldn't quite control. Dalton is something, he's something important, he knows something we don't. I know that, you stupid girl, thought Clarissa, and I never miss my mark. Dalton, she whispered, and this would have to be the first of many times, because as much as she would have liked to lose herself in him, that was the only thing she couldn't do right now. He wanted to tell her something he felt was desperately important, something he couldn't say aloud, and if she didn't take it now, he might lock it further inside him. He might seal it away. She said his name again, twisting it around her tongue, fitting it to shape of her indelicate longings. Dalton, promise me, he said again, and he was ragged this time, wretched and weak, and she was struggling to maintain her thoughts. What did he want her to know? It was something powerful, almost explosive, but it warped and waned. He wanted her to know, but couldn't tell her. He wanted something he couldn't confess aloud, something that could devastate them both. What was it? He was close now, closer, and she had her legs sneaked around his waist, her arms locked around his neck. What did Callum have to do with it? Turned the gun around, pulled the trigger. The knot inside her tightened, swelling up and pulsing in her veins. Her heart was quick too, quick, muscles straining. Dalton, Dalton, Dalton. He was as good as she wanted him to be, traumatically so. This was a torment she would seek again and again. The trauma of him was exquisite, the vice of his intimacy, combative and honeyed. Oh, he was full of lies and secrets, and only some of which she wanted to keep. What had he done? What did he know? What did he want? She only saw it in the moment she let go, soundlessly crying out between his lips. So it was her intimacy he wanted then. Only when she was vulnerable, taking pleasure at his hands, could he forget that what she was long enough to let her see. She came, and his mind went with her, eruptive in relief. It was a fragment of an idea, the fractured silver of a larger truth, so small and so sharp she almost missed it, like a thorn on a root underfoot. She stumbled on it. He wanted her not to die. Clarissa, the small voice she'd heard. It was part of that same thought, the same fear. Clarissa, don't go. Clarissa, please, please safe. It slid into her mind like a splinter, a silver. It was such a tiny thought, so innocuous, buried indiscreetly in a shallow grave of apprehension. He had countless worries jagged little aches of thought, but this was so easy to find. She could trip over it, and she had. She reached up, clawing a hand around his jaw. Who's going to kill me? She had asked quickly enough that there would be no time to prevent his answer. Already he was exposed to her, enraptured, undone. Remorse would set in later. Maybe resentment, maybe regret. For now, though, he would never be more hers. The words had left her lips for him to swallow. Ably he gulped them down his throat. Everyone, he choked aloud, and then she understood it. They will have to kill you to keep themselves alive.